Well, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention released a report this week that says in 2020, 79% of all homicides involved firearms. That's the highest rate recorded in over 25 years.
Now joining us live to explain this upsurge and provide some possible solutions is Robert Perkinson, a University of Hawaii professor and criminal justice specialist. Thank you, Professor, for joining us. So what is behind this surge? Are guns just more available, or are people just more angry these days?
Both may be true. The U.S. does stand out among industrialized democracies in having a huge number of firearms circulating. Some 300 million are in the country, and that number has surged with the political polarization and with the pandemic. But there clearly are other causes too. This is a big rise in gun violence. And it's worth noting that more than half of these 45,000 gun deaths are suicides. So clearly, the mental health is a serious issue here as well.
Yeah, and how much do you think, if at all, does the pandemic play a part in this?
It's so hard to know. We're living through this global social and mass psychology experiment. But as we all know, it's had isolation from friends, removal from schooling, shutdown of schools has had really severe effects. It's been most pronounced in the communities that were already most vulnerable to health problems and violence, and that's where we've seen the surge in gun homicides as well. So it's probably quite significant.
And the CDC report showed the firearm homicide and suicide rates were highest among people with low incomes. Talk about that correlation, please.
Well, there's a lot of causes of gun violence, availability of guns, cultural factors, economic factors, racial stratification factors. One problem that the US has is that for 2 generations, we've tried to deal with crime by focusing almost exclusively on kind of hard power and punitive solutions, and we've neglected our mental health infrastructure. And those sorts of mental health services are least available in the poorest communities. That can certainly, just like with the pandemic, can be an exacerbating factor.
Talk about the trends. What are we seeing here locally? Are we seeing any correlations to this national study, or where lower income areas are seeing higher rates?
We are fortunate in Hawaii, in part because of the culture of Hawaii and because guns are more regulated, a little bit more like other dangerous objects, like say cars, in Hawaii than in other parts of the continental US. That gun violence, homicides are a lot lower. They have been trending upward, but the numbers are small enough that we don't know how statistically significant those are. We have not seen a huge surge in suicides, but we have been seeing, a really alarming reporting of rising anxiety and depression levels, especially among adolescents. And when you combine adolescent impulsivity, depression, anxiety, and firearm availability, that can be a deadly mix.
And really quickly, before we wrap up, why do you think we're seeing that in adolescents? Do you know?
No one knows. There is speculation that social media has changed the ways we interact with people, and that may be causing harm, but it's difficult to prove. Certainly, the socioeconomic anxieties related to the pandemic and the isolation have taken a toll. I can say, as a college professor, our students in large numbers are suffering. They need help, they need community building, they need attention, they need social interaction. So this is going to be something we're going to all have to work on for some time to come.
Yeah, you kind of touched on it, but what are some possible solutions to try to reduce these homicide deaths?
Well, we have tried in the US a lot of solutions that come first to mind, which is, locking people up, extending sentences, trying to increase deterrence. Tragically, we've spent a lot of money doing that, and that has proven not to work. So what we need to try to do now are different sorts of interventions, kind of sensible gun safety rules, background checks without loopholes, and so on, which Hawaii already has implemented, but the rest of the US hasn't. More provision of mental health services with less wait times for emergency services. We're seeing that's a big problem in Hawaii right now, that people are in distress and they can't get help when they need it right at the emergency moment. And it's something we're going to have to build into schools to try to enhance a sense of community, rebuild a sense of community and friendship and our social skills among students, and economic and social and racial stratification, as we have in Hawaii too, also can play a role. All of the things that make people isolated, dispirited, can increase the possibility of gun violence.
Yeah, definitely a troubling trend. And Robert Perkinson with University of Hawaii, thank you so much for stopping by. We really appreciate you shedding some light on this topic.
Thanks so much for having me.